The morning sky over the rolling hills of North Carolina carried that particular shade of pale gold that only comes before something important happens. At the test track of Sterling Apex Motorsports, every camera, every executive, every investor in the company's orbit had gathered to witness what was being called the rebirth of an empire. The Apex R9, a $14 million prototype race car, sat under the soft lights of the launch bay like a polished black blade. And at the back of the technical bay, in dark blue overalls smudged with engine grease, a single father named Flynn Callahan stood quietly listening to a sound no one else in the room seemed to hear. Flynn was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with brown hair cut short and the kind of tired, gentle eyes that belonged to a man who had lost more than he ever talked about. To the new generation of engineers at Sterling Apex, he was just another mechanic on the floor. None of them knew that the slight, dry knock living beneath the engine's smooth roar was the first whisper of a disaster that could destroy not just a car, but a company, and that Flynn, with his hands stained black and his name long forgotten in the executive suite, was the only person in the building who could understand. Vivian Sterling, 28, the new chief executive of the company her late father had built, stepped onto the small stage with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed her own composure in mirrors. She wore a cream V-neck dress under a tailored black blazer, her chestnut hair loose at her shoulders, her voice clean and unhurried as she promised the room a return to glory. Behind her, the Apex R9 waited like a promise about to be tested. Flynn heard the knock again. Sharp, dull, dry, pressed in beneath the hum like a heartbeat that did not belong. He turned to a young engineer named Otis Warren and said, calmly, that the car should not run. Otis glanced at his tablet, saw nothing red, and shrugged. Dermot Blake, the company's head of engineering, a tall man of 44 with sharp cheekbones and a sharper temper, stepped between them with practiced contempt. He told Flynn his job was to clean tools, not to interfere with prototypes. Data, he reminded the floor, did not lie, but Flynn knew what data did not measure. He knew that an ignition map slightly out of phase with cylinder pressure could pass every sensor and still tear an engine apart in 3 seconds at full throttle. He knew the difference between the sound of a healthy machine and the sound of one already in pain. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the Apex R9 was about to be sent out to scream. When the test driver lowered himself toward the cockpit, Flynn moved. He stepped past Otis, past 2 surprised technicians, past the velvet rope of perception that separated mechanics from prototypes, and opened the auxiliary engine panel. With one hand he disconnected the secondary fuel line. With the other he pulled a small ignition coupler back from a connector that had clearly been running too hot. The engine coughed once, exhaled a thin tail of white smoke, and went still. The crowd turned as one. Dermot's voice cut across the bay like a whip. He just sabotaged the car. Vivian stepped down from the stage, the cameras following her every step. She saw a low-level mechanic with grease on his hands standing beside a smoking prototype, and her mind, already coiled tight by months of pressure from a board that did not believe in her, did the math her training told it to do. This was a public relations catastrophe taking place in real time, in front of the most important investors in the company's history, and a man she did not know was standing at the center of it. Flynn tried to explain. If you let that car run, the engine will come apart at speed. Vivian's expression hardened. He looked her in the eye, his voice steady, his hands open. You can fire me later, he said. But first, please, check the ignition map. Don't put the car back on the track. She did not hear him through the noise inside her own head. She felt the eyes of the board on her back. She felt the whisper she had carried since the day she took her father's chair, that she was only the daughter, only the heir, only the soft thing standing in his place. And so, in front of the cameras and the investors and a small girl with a worn rabbit plush, she made the fastest, hardest decision of her career. "You're fired," she said. "Leave the test grounds." Now, the girl behind the rope was Louisa Callahan, 6 years old, hair the color of wheat in late afternoon. Eyes wide and frightened above the rabbit she clutched at her chest. Her mother had given her that rabbit, and her mother was no longer in the world, and the only steady thing left in her small life was the man in the dark blue overalls who fixed everything that ever broke. Louisa slipped past the rope and ran to her father's side. She looked up at the woman in the cream dress and said, in the small, brave voice of a child who knew nothing about contracts but everything about her own father, "He didn't break the car. My dad fixes everything that's hurt." Vivian's mouth tightened. She did not let herself look down at the child. "Your father broke protocol," she said, and the room heard it, and a few of the older mechanics lowered their eyes. Flynn knelt down gently in front of his daughter. He brushed a tear off her cheek with the back of his thumb. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Let's go. I don't want you to remember me by this moment." He took the company badge from his chest, handed it to a security guard who could not meet his eyes, and lifted Louisa's small hand into his own. Without arguing, without raising his voice, he walked her past the rows of gleaming race cars she had been born to admire, past the trophies of victories he had quietly built into being, and out the long glass corridor toward the parking lot. Louisa looked back once, just once, as if she could not understand why a place her father loved had decided, all at once, to break him. Vivian watched him go. She did not yet know that she had just dismissed the man who had built every car in that hallway, and that the company she was trying to save would, within the next few hours, be saved only by him. 3 days before the engine ever knocked, the morning had begun the way every morning began in the small house Flynn rented at the edge of a quiet town 20 minutes from the Sterling Apex track. On one wall hung a framed photograph of a woman with soft eyes, holding a much smaller Louisa in a hospital blanket. Flynn did not look at it for long. He had learned in the years since her death that grief could be carried more easily if you did not stand still in front of it. He toasted bread, cracked 2 eggs, poured milk into a small blue cup. Louisa appeared in the doorway with her hair tangled and her rabbit under one arm, asking him, in the way she had been asking for nearly a year, whether he could braid her hair the way her mother used to. Flynn tried. He always tried. The braid came out crooked and a little loose, and Louisa laughed at it the way she always laughed, and Flynn smiled into the back of her head and thought, as he often did, that the most important work of his life had nothing to do with engines. In the truck on the way to school, Louisa traced a circle on the foggy window and asked him why he was not the boss of the race cars anymore, the way he was in the old pictures she had found in a shoebox in the closet. Flynn paused at the stoplight. "The most important job I have now," he said, "is being your dad. Everything else is just work." She nodded as if that made perfect sense, because to a 6-year-old who had already lost a mother, it did. At Sterling Apex he moved through the bay quietly, the way he had moved for years. He arrived earlier than the engineers. He laid out tools. He listened to engines warm up the way other men listened to music. The young technicians passed him without seeing him. Sometimes they joked that Flynn was the radio of the shop, always tuned to whatever the car was saying. He did not correct them. He did not need them to know what he had once been. In a corner of the old break room, behind a row of newer awards, hung a faded photograph of a much younger Flynn standing beside a man with kind eyes and a silver beard. The man was Vivian's father. The photograph had been there so long that no one looked at it anymore. In the hallway near the executive offices, a retired race car sat under a glass case, and a small brass plaque on the base read, in letters most visitors never noticed, "Legacy Platform by FEO." See, none of the new engineers had ever bothered to ask what those initials meant. 2 floors above the workshop, In a corner office with a wall of glass that overlooked the test track, Vivian Sterling was learning what it meant to inherit a company older than she was. She had grown up among engines, spent her childhood in pit lanes, learning the names of bolts before she learned the names of states, sitting on her father's lap while he listened to the radio chatter of races. Her father had been a man who believed that the soul of a company lived in the people who touched the work. He had built Sterling Apex on that belief, and for 30 years it had won him races and quiet, lasting respect. When he died, the board moved fast. New advisors arrived with strategies and dashboards and consultant decks. Quarterly metrics replaced quarterly walks through the bay. Engineers were promoted for managing project charts rather than reading torque curves. And Vivian, 28 years old and aware of every whisper that called her the heiress, learned to wear her father's title like armor she had not yet earned the right to remove. She was not a cruel young woman. She was a frightened one in a job that did not allow fear. She wore tailored dresses and structured blazers because she had learned painfully that softness was read in boardrooms as weakness. She rehearsed her sentences in the mirror before press events. She studied her father's old letters at night, looking for the trick of being respected. And what she found instead was the slow, grinding pressure of being measured every day against a man whose shoes she could not quite fill. Dermot Blake had been one of her father's lieutenants, and he had been waiting his whole career for this exact moment. He understood that a young chief executive under pressure does not want to hear about problems. She wants to hear about solutions. He brought her solutions every week, polished and confident, and he buried, beneath those solutions, every concern raised by older mechanics who still trusted their ears more than their tablets. He told her that the future of racing belonged to data, simulation, and clean executive control. He told her, again and again, that men like Flynn Callahan were the past. Vivian believed him because she needed to. She needed someone to be the past so that she could be the future. In the meeting the night before the launch, she stood at the head of a long glass table and told her staff that any deviation from approved protocol during the public test would be treated as a fireable offense. She said it slowly, deliberately, looking each of them in the eye. She did not know, as she said it, that she was building the trap she was about to fall into. She only knew that she could not afford one more whisper, one more raised eyebrow, one more headline suggesting that the heiress had lost her grip. When she walked through the bay later that night, she paused once near the safety zone where a small girl with a rabbit plush was waiting for her father to finish his shift. Vivian almost smiled at her. Almost. But the weight of the next morning pressed down on her shoulders, and she turned away before the smile could land. The Apex R9 had been built on a chassis Flynn himself had drawn the original lines for, years before, when he was still allowed to sign things with his full name. The new engineering team had layered modern systems on top of those bones. A turbocharged engine, an electronic ignition map, smart fuel injection, real-time telemetry. On the spec sheets, it looked seamless. In Flynn's ear, it did not. He had heard it for the first time 2 nights before the launch, during a low-load test in the back bay. The engine had hummed beautifully across the lower range. But when the load shifted, when the turbo began to spool, there was a single faint dry knock, almost too soft to register, that lived between 2 sensor measurements. Flynn knew that knock. He had heard it once, years ago, on a prototype that had killed itself on a test lap in front of him. The ignition was firing a few thousandths of a second too early relative to chamber pressure. At low speed, it was nothing. At full throttle, under load, with the secondary fuel line pushing the boundary of its rating, it was a piston coming through the block. He told Otis. Otis looked at his tablet and said the diagnostics were green. Flynn asked him to pull the ignition map. Otis said only senior engineers had access. Flynn went looking for Dermot. Dermot was in his office, reviewing a presentation slide titled, in clean white letters, Apex R9, Restoring the Legacy. When Flynn knocked, Dermot did not stand up. Flynn told him about the knock, the timing, the load curve, the fuel line heat. He told him plainly that he believed the car would not survive a full throttle pull on the public track. Dermot listened the way a man listens to a noise he has already decided to ignore. "Flynn," he said, with the practiced patience of someone speaking to a child, "you might have been useful 10 years ago." "Today we have data," Flynn answered quietly. "Data only tells you what the sensors can measure." The knock I'm hearing lives between two sensors. It was the kind of sentence that, in a healthier company, would have stopped a meeting. In this one, it ended Flynn's access. Dermot ordered the technicians to keep him away from the laptop that controlled the prototype. He told them with a satisfied smile that the floor would run cleaner without an old voice, second-guessing the new tools. That night Flynn wrote down everything he had heard. The exact engine speed at which the knock appeared, the temperature of the auxiliary fuel line, the behavior of the ignition timing on the dashboard he had been allowed to glimpse. He folded the page once and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He only knew that the truth was best when written down before it was needed. Walking out to the parking lot that evening, Louisa took his hand. "Daddy, why do you keep listening to it?" she asked. Flynn smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. "Because sometimes machines speak very softly," he said. "If you don't listen right away, they will scream by breaking apart." She did not yet know how true that sentence was about to become. The morning of the launch, Flynn's babysitter called 20 minutes before he was due to leave the house. Her own child had a fever. The school had a teacher work day he had forgotten on the kitchen calendar. He buckled Louisa into the truck, drove her to the bay, and walked her to the safety zone behind the velvet rope. He told her not to wander. He told her he would be back. He kissed the top of her head and went to work, not knowing he was about to lose that work in front of her. Vivian saw the child from the corner of her eye as she stepped onto the stage. For one beat, before the cameras started rolling, something in her softened. She remembered being small in the pit lane herself, sitting on a stack of tires, watching her father move among men in coveralls. Then a board member touched her elbow, and the moment passed, and she did not look at the small girl again until the worst possible moment. Flynn drove home in silence. Louisa sat strapped in the passenger seat, the rabbit pressed under her chin. After nearly 20 minutes, she asked him, very quietly, if the people back at the track thought he was a bad man. Flynn pulled into the gravel drive and turned in his seat to face her. He did not curse the woman who had fired him. He did not blame the engineer who had ignored him. He gave his daughter the only answer he believed. "Other people misunderstanding you doesn't make you bad," he said. "But you have to live right enough that someday the truth has a place to stand." Inside the house, he opened a closet she had never been allowed to dig through. He pulled out a metal box and placed it on the kitchen table. He simply opened it and let his hands rest on what was inside. Technical drawings on yellowed paper, an early award engraved with his full name, a stack of letters in Vivian's father's careful handwriting. He did not call anyone. He did not pick up the phone to fight for himself. He had learned a long time ago that a man who has to announce his own credentials has already lost the room. The truth would have to come from the data, or it would not come at all. Back at Sterling Apex, the truth had already begun to leak. Vivian sat in a glass-walled conference room and watched the launch footage on a wide screen. Dermot stood beside her, sketching out a press statement that described a low-level employee who had violated protocol and been swiftly removed. He used words like decisive and exemplary leadership. He smiled when he said them. Vivian did not. She watched Flynn approach the car a second time, frame by frame. She noticed something she had been too angry to see in person. He was not panicked. He was not furtive. He moved the way a surgeon moved, precise and urgent and clearly inside a procedure he had performed before. She rewound the footage. She watched a man who looked for all the world like he was saving something, not destroying it. She asked Otis to come into the room. The young engineer arrived white in the face. Under direct questioning, he admitted that Flynn had warned them the previous night about a knock he had heard during a low-load test. Dermot moved to interrupt. Vivian held up one hand, and to her own surprise, the room obeyed it. Otis kept talking, describing the conversation, describing Flynn's calm, describing his own choice to trust the data over the voice of an older man who had no title beside his name. While Otis was still speaking, the door opened. A junior technician said, in a small, scared voice, that the engineering team had restarted the prototype to assess damage, and the knock was back. Louder this time. Exactly where Flynn had said it would be. Vivian looked at Dermot. For the first time, since her father's funeral, she let herself see him clearly, and what she saw was a man who had just been caught. Archie Bennett was 62 years old, a retired chief engineer with a silver beard and the careful walk of a man who had spent his life on shop floors. He had flown in that morning at Vivian's personal invitation, intended as the honored guest of the Apex R9 launch. His flight had been delayed. By the time his rental car pulled up to the gate, the launch was already in pieces, and a hostile silence hung over the bay like smoke. He walked into the conference room without knocking. He listened for 30 seconds before he understood what was being discussed. Then he asked the question that broke the room open. "Who?" he said, his voice quiet, his eyes cold. "Just told me that Flynn Callahan sabotaged a car." Dermot tried to laugh. He waved a hand and said it was a personnel matter, nothing for a guest to concern himself with. Archie ignored him. He walked past the conference table, past Vivian, past the security guard at the door, and into the bay where the Apex R9 sat with its hood still raised. He looked at the auxiliary fuel line, the ignition coupler, the small smudge of grease on the connector where Flynn's hand had moved. He stood in front of the car for a long time without saying anything. And when he turned around, his voice was low and even. "He saved that engine." Vivian asked him how he could know that. Archie answered her without taking his eyes off the prototype. "Because the man who taught me to listen for that exact failure," he said, "was Flynn." The room went very still. Vivian asked her assistant to open the legacy archive, the design files from the years before her father's death. Dermot objected loudly. He said the old files were irrelevant, that they were outside the scope of the current investigation. Vivian, who had spent the last hour learning what it cost to trust a man who used the word irrelevant to bury inconvenient truths, said one word. "Open them." The screen filled with documents. Chassis, schematics. Cooling architecture. Ignition, baseline. Torque distribution maps. Race program design dossiers de show. At the bottom corner of nearly every legacy document was a small, careful signature. F. Callahan, lead engineer. Archie stood beside the screen and spoke as if he were finally being allowed to deliver a eulogy he had been holding for years. He told Vivian that Flynn had been the youngest lead engineer in the company's history. That he had not just designed cars, he had built them with his hands, tested them on the track, listened to them at night, adjusted their characters one cylinder at a time. That every one of the trophies in the front lobby of Sterling Apex sat on a foundation Flynn had drawn before the new tools existed. That when his wife had died, Flynn had asked Vivian's father for a quiet lower role so he could go home in the evenings and raise his daughter, and her father, who had loved Flynn like a son, had given it to him without hesitation. The records had been sealed. The new leadership had never bothered to break the seal. Vivian sank slowly into the nearest chair. Across her mind ran the small voice of a 6-year-old girl who had said, before being led from the test grounds in disgrace, that her father fixed everything that was hurt. The sentence, which had sounded sentimental in the moment, now landed like a verdict. Vivian understood, with an instinct she had not used in months, that a private apology would not be enough. She had fired Flynn in front of a crowd. She had let the cameras record his name as a saboteur. She had let his daughter, a child she had glanced at without truly seeing, hear that judgment with her own ears. The truth, like the harm, would have to be public. She suspended Dermot on the spot. She told her communications team to halt all outgoing statements. She summoned the board, the investors, the engineers, the floor mechanics, and the same press pool that had filmed Flynn's dismissal back into the main test bay. When the room was full, she stepped to the front without notes. She said plainly 3 things. She said that Flynn Callahan had not damaged the Apex R9. She said that Flynn Callahan had prevented a serious engine failure that, at full throttle, could have ended in injury and the destruction of a $14 million prototype. And she said that Flynn Callahan was the engineer whose hands and ears had built the technical foundation of every race car the company had ever celebrated. Archie joined her at the front and walked the audience through the failure with the patience of a teacher. The slight ignition phase error. The auxiliary fuel line running above its safe rating. The exact moment the knock would have escalated into catastrophic damage. He pulled up the system logs. He showed the timestamp at which the unsafe configuration had been written into the prototype. The timestamp was dated 2 nights before the launch. The user account that wrote it belonged to Dermot Blake. Dermot tried to speak. He said he had been optimizing performance. Archie answered without raising his voice, that optimization without simulation, risk review, or signed authorization was not optimization. It was negligence dressed in confidence. Dermot had not only been wrong about the engineering, he had violated the same protocol he had used as a weapon against Flynn. The investors did not erupt. They went very quiet, which is what investors do when they are calculating exactly how angry they are allowed to be. The board members shifted in their seats and waited to see what Vivian would do next. She did not hide. She turned to face the room and said, without flinching, "I made a decision too quickly. I trusted a title instead of the truth, and I dismissed the man who saved this car." She projected the legacy archive onto the wall behind her. The room watched as the design history of Sterling Apex Motorsports unspooled across the screen, every drawing signed in the same careful hand. A few of the older mechanics, men who had worked beside Flynn before his quiet retreat to the floor, lowered their heads. One of them wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. He had waited a long time to see one of his own put back where he belonged. But Flynn was not in the room. The reversal had been delivered to everyone except the man it was for. Vivian understood, looking at the empty space where he should have been standing, that she had one more thing to do, and that she could not do it from behind a podium. She had to leave the building. She drove herself, which she rarely did. She told her assistant not to call ahead. She put the address into the navigation system and drove 20 minutes through farmland and small intersections until she was parked at the edge of a gravel driveway in front of a modest 1-story house with white siding and a child's bicycle leaning against the porch. She sat in the car for a full minute before she opened the door. Flynn answered the bell himself. He had changed out of his overalls into a clean gray t-shirt. He looked at her without surprise, without satisfaction, without anger. Behind him, Louisa stood half hidden in the hallway, the rabbit pressed to her chest, watching the woman from the bad day with the wary, steady eyes of a child who had already learned that adults could be dangerous. Vivian, in her tailored dress and black blazer, looked suddenly out of place against the small porch. Power, she realized, did not travel well into rooms it had hurt. She did not start with corporate language. She told him plainly that she had reviewed the data, that she had seen the legacy archive, that she knew what Dermot had done, that she knew what Flynn had done, and that she knew what she had done. Flynn listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question. "Did you know all of that," he said, "before or after my daughter heard you call me a man who broke protocol?" Vivian did not answer right away. She did not have an answer that would not feel like a wound. She finally said, simply, "After." Louisa stepped forward then, just one step, and looked up at her. "Are you here to take my dad away again?" she asked, in a voice so small It barely fit in the doorway. Vivian did the only honest thing she could think of. She lowered herself slowly until she was at eye level with the child. "No," she said. "I came to tell you that I was wrong. Your dad didn't break the car. Your dad saved the car. And I'm sorry I scared you." Louisa did not answer. She turned and looked up at her father, the way she always did when she was not sure how to feel. Flynn placed a hand on her shoulder. He told Vivian, in a voice that carried no heat, that he was not interested in money or a fancy title to make the moment go away. If she wanted him to come back, the truth would have to be told in front of the same people who had watched him leave in shame. Louisa would have to hear it. The mechanics on the floor would have to hear it. The cameras would have to hear it. Vivian agreed without hesitating. She invited him back to the bay, not as an employee being summoned, but as the only person who could bring the prototype and the company's name back into the light. Flynn was quiet for a long time. He had reasons to refuse. He had earned the right to refuse. He looked down at his daughter, who was still studying him with those serious eyes, and he asked her, only half teasing, if she thought he should help. Louisa thought about it. She tugged on the rabbit's ear. Then she said, "Daddy, if the car is still hurt, will you fix it?" Flynn smiled, very faintly. He looked back at Vivian. "I don't fix things because people deserve it," he said. "I fix them because it's the right thing to do." The next morning, the test track wore a different kind of light. The investors had returned. The board had returned. The cameras had returned. Even Dermot was made to attend, escorted by 2 members of the security team, and seated at the back, where he could watch. The bay was as full as it had been the day before, but the sound inside it had changed. There was in the air the particular kind of stillness that gathers in a room about to witness a debt being repaid. Flynn walked in beside his daughter. He had not borrowed a suit. He wore the same dark blue overalls he always wore, clean now, the company logo stitched neatly above the chest. Louisa held his hand. The rabbit dangled from her other arm. The two of them moved through the rows of engineers and executives without hurrying, and the room, almost without meaning to, parted for them. Otis Warren met them halfway across the floor. He did not make a speech. He said, in a low voice, that he should have listened. Flynn looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. He did not crush the young man with a longer answer. There were lessons that taught themselves, given enough silence. Vivian stood beside the prototype. She did not greet Flynn with corporate warmth. She simply stepped aside, the way one steps aside for a surgeon, and let him approach the car. He worked the way he had always worked. Hood up. Hands clean. Eyes closed for a moment as he listened to the bay around him. He disabled the automated tuning mode. He pulled the ignition map back to a baseline he had drawn years before, a baseline that had won races. He replaced a heat sensor whose response curve had drifted out of tolerance. He nodded to the test driver. The Apex R9 started with a low, even rumble. No knock. No smoke. The driver eased it onto the track. The first lap was clean. The second lap was faster. The third lap broke the company's own internal record, by a margin that made one of the older engineers laugh out loud, and then immediately apologize. When the car came to a stop, the room did not cheer the way it had been ready to cheer the day before. The sound was different. It was the slow, deliberate applause of people who had almost paid for their carelessness with a man's career and a child's faith. Vivian walked over to Flynn and Louisa Dotto. She did not speak from a podium. She offered him in front of everyone the role of chief race engineer. Flynn did not answer right away. He said that he would only return on certain conditions. Every technical concern raised on the floor, regardless of the title or age or background of the person raising it, would be heard. No employee would be dismissed without an honest review. And Sterling Apex would build a real support program for single parents, so that no one would ever have to choose, the way he once had, between staying close to a child and being respected at work. Vivian agreed in front of the room. The board did not object. The investors did not object. A few of them, in fact, looked relieved, as if a question they had been afraid to ask had finally been answered without them. In the late afternoon, when the cameras had gone, Flynn stood at the edge of the empty track with Louise on his shoulders. The rabbit hung from her hand. The Apex R9 sat quiet in the bay behind them. Vivian watched from a respectful distance, content for the first time in a long time to let a moment belong to someone else. Louisa leaned forward against the top of her father's head. "Daddy," she said, "do they know now that you built the cars?" Flynn looked out at the long ribbon of asphalt. "Maybe," he said. She thought about that. Then she asked, "Are you happy?" He held her ankles a little tighter. He thought about the years he had spent quiet, the night he had been fired in front of her, the morning he had come back without armor or revenge. He thought about his wife, who had taught him, before she ever left, that being right mattered less than being kind. "I'm happy," he said, "because you got to see that the truth doesn't have to shout." Behind them, in the cooling silence of the bay, the cars he had built waited, exactly where he had left them. Some men spend their whole lives building things the world later forgets to honor. When the truth finally arrives for those men, it does not need to take revenge. It only needs to walk into a room, set the record straight, and let the silence do the rest.